I'm going to be covering two chapters in this video. The first one on early medieval Europe, and the second chapter on Romanesque art. And both of these, along with Gothic art, make up the medieval ages, or the Dark Ages, and I kind of want to give just a little bit of a timeline for that. As you can see on the timeline below, we have classical art, that is both the Greek and the Roman civilizations, that end around 400 AD. And then we go into the medieval or Dark Ages, and that stretches from 400 AD all the way to around 1300, 1400 AD. So the Middle Ages are broken up into three distinct categories: early medieval, Romanesque, and then Gothic, and we'll be covering Gothic in a separate lecture. When that ends, it transforms into the Renaissance, and we'll be covering that in Survey 2. So we'll begin with early medieval Europe. And here's kind of a map of the world at this time. There's a few cities that we're interested in. Up toward the southeast portion of England is SUTTON, which is going to be where we have a ship burial. We have KELLS up here, which will have some illuminated manuscripts from there. We'll look at Reims next week when we talk about Gothic art, Cologne in Germany. The Lindau Gospels comes from the city of Lindau. And then, of course, we have from the previous chapters the cities of Ravenna and Rome. So let's take a little bit of a look at history here. We have the Roman Empire that has fallen. Around 476, Germanic kingdoms sack Rome, and barbarians, or Germanic tribes, such as the Visigoths, Vandals, and Franks, rose to power by the 6th century. The 1,000 years between the 5th and the 15th century, that's perceived as an age of darkness, devoid of culture. It's a gap between classical antiquity and the Italian Renaissance. But we're finding out that the Dark Ages weren't all that dark, and a lot of new scholarship has been done on this time period. But overall, compared to the Renaissance or compared to classical ages, there's still not a whole lot known about this time period, as it was incredibly unstable. So we're going to take a look at England first, and on the east coast of England, we have the SUTTON ship burial. And this was found, excavated in 1938. This farm has 7 different mounds, and about 3 of them have been uncovered. If you can see the cursor on the screen at the very top, that's the largest mound. That's where the SUTTON burial ship was found. And I also have a link on the site for you on Canvas showing you some of the actual footage of them excavating this ship. And most likely a person of incredible importance was buried here. And this is a ceremonial ship. This did not ever sail on a sea or anything like that. The person was buried along with belongings. Some of the belongings that are metal have been recovered, but mostly everything else is pretty much rotted. But we do have swords, shields, helmets, silver bowls, and spoons. But even like the bones of the person who was here have pretty much disintegrated. We have some really a beautiful purse top here, and I'll show you what this would have looked like had it been intact. The beautiful scroll work at the top is something we see a lot during the Middle Ages, and we'll definitely see that again on the illuminated manuscripts we'll be covering later on in this lecture. But we've also got some very abstracted animals, and when we look at the bottom level here, moving at the far left and right, we have a person that is looking as if they're being attacked by wolves. The mouth is open and the person is screaming. And then toward the center, we also have some opposite works of a duck being attacked by an eagle. So overall, the imagery here is quite violent. It reminds me a lot of the intricacies that we saw in the pictorial of SENUSRET II when we studied our chapter on Egypt. And there's also some indications that this does look like that front of the bull-headed lyre that we saw in the ancient Middle East chapter. And this is a reconstruction of what we think this would have looked like had it been attached to the purse. But as I mentioned, the purse itself had rotted. We do have the coins that were in the purse, though, and I'll show you that in a future slide. This is basically a clasp or buckle. And we have this beautiful helmet. And here are the coins that were found under the purse lid, as well as a shield. Another burial ship is the Osberg burial ship, and this is Viking in nature. Now, the Vikings traveled everywhere, from the Norwegian coastline and England to Russia, Iceland, Greenland, and rumored even to have arrived in North America. This civilization is the last of the pagans, and when they would arrive at a place, they would attack, conquer, and then colonize. Now, this work is very much like the SUTTON ship burial that we just saw. It was also found underneath an earthen mound, and the ship itself was richly decorated for ceremonial use. And there was a queen that was buried here. Accompanied to the grave with her was also a slave girl. 12 horses had been sacrificed, along with an ox and 3 dogs. All sorts of equipment had been found, including agricultural and kitchen equipment. There was dough for baking bread, blueberries and apples, but there wasn't any precious jewelry found, and this may have been material that was looted long ago. You can see the reconstruction here is really amazing. The ship is absolutely gigantic, 63 feet from one end to the other, and width-wise, it's about 18 feet at its widest. The ship could have been powered by either a sail or an oar, and it really shows a culmination of centuries of shipbuilding technology. And here's an animal head post from that ship, and you can see again the intricacies very much like on that purse lid from the SUTTON burial ship. And I kind of want to stay in this area of the world in Norway and talk about what a stave church is. Now, stave churches are one of my favorites because they're such a unique structure. These are Christian churches, and they're called stave churches because they are held up by 4 timbers, and those are called staves. They form the structural core of the church. And here's a better image of what they truly look like. They are dark because they're covered with tar every 5 years to preserve them. I also love the way that the eaves and rooftop of the church are extremely steeped. They're very angled so that any snow that falls on it will immediately fall off. The gables also, they will have either a cross or a dragon head on them, and that's to protect the church and the congregation from trolls and demons. Now, at one time, there were between 1,000 and 2,000 of these churches throughout Scandinavia. Today, only about 28 of them remain. And unfortunately, what would happen is when these churches were being rebuilt, they would take parts of other churches. And so it was kind of like how we would view a used car lot. We just start taking parts and the other churches end up just becoming scrap. So you can kind of see the people walking around the church here to give you an idea of how large these churches were. So here's a little bit better indication of the dragons' heads and crosses. And the format of the church. And this work here was added, again, it's kind of apart from something else that came earlier, but then got incorporated into the wall of the church. But again, a wonderful, intricate design. And here's a close-up so you can see the almost roughness or textural quality of this church from the tar that is continually added to preserve it. And now we're going to talk about the equestrian portrait of Charles the Bald. Now, for years, art historians have told us that this was actually Charlemagne, and you'll find that listed in a lot of the old art history texts. But scholars have since updated their views and letting us know that this is really the grandson of Charlemagne, who is Charles. Now, Charlemagne's important because he rises to power in the second half of the 8th century and forms the Carolingian Empire. Charlemagne is going to rule for 50 years, and he's a person who imposes Christianity throughout the empire. In fact, he is crowned emperor by Pope Leo III at St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, in the Vatican, and he is declared as the successor to Constantine, who of course is the very first Christian emperor. And here we have a close-up of the face. And it is very reminiscent of this sculpture of Marcus Aurelius that we saw earlier in the semester during the chapter on the Roman Empire. But however, the sculpture of Marcus Aurelius is gigantic. The sculpture of Charles the Bald here at the left is about 9.5 inches tall. But it is about still glorifying the ruler. We have him wearing a ceremonial robe, as you see also in the sculpture of Marcus Aurelius. We can see that there is a ceremonial sword at his side, and he is holding an orb, which is a sign of power. We also have medieval books being created during this time period. And this is something that the Carolingian rulers really promoted in terms of learning and also a way to propagate Christianity, as well as to standardize church law and practice. So at these different monasteries, you would have workshops called scriptoriums, and they would produce key religious texts. And you would also have people who would be proofreading to make sure most mistakes would be omitted. And also, these had to be copied by hand. We didn't have a printing press at this time. So we're going to look at the Book of Kells first, which you saw in the display case in the previous image. It was created in Ireland or Scotland around the year 800. And you have 3 letters on its surface, XPI, which spell out Chi Rho Iota, which is an abbreviation for the word Christ. And this page itself is the very first page of the book of Matthew, which is the first time that Christ is mentioned in the Bible. 4 scribes and 3 painters would have worked on this text, and it would have taken them over a month just to produce this page alone. And we have a lot of other things going on in this text that I'd like to point out. One thing is the face of Christ right here at the end of the letter P. We have the term down here, generatio, which is a Latin phrase, or at least part of the Latin phrase, referring to the birth of Christ. Over here we have cats that are pouncing on mice that are eating the wafers that are used in the Eucharist. And I also want to point out that this is made on a paper product called vellum, which is calf skin. And it took over 300 calf skins to create this text. And here we have a zooming in of the cats pouncing on the mice, eating that Eucharist wafer. And then holding up the letters, we have these angels. And off to the angel at the right, we have a moth, which is pretty cool. So again, you can see absolutely the variation here in both figure and in script. When we look at monasteries, you know, these are centers of prayer, of learning, and of art, at least artistic production. And during this time, you've got to figure that most of the world is illiterate. And those that are trained in reading and writing are going to be in these monasteries. Now, they wouldn't just produce illuminated manuscripts. These monks, as well as nuns, would produce jewelry, carvings, and textiles. And it's an important correlation to make that the church is producing art. And the idea of church and art becoming interrelated, the church becoming a patron of the arts, is extremely important as we reach into the Italian Renaissance. Here's another religious text, the Lindisfarne Gospels. This here is one of my favorite pages. Again, just from the pattern itself is so wonderful. You almost lose yourself in the pattern to where you can't even see that there's a cross on the surface as well. And as we zoom in, we can see that the pattern itself also has figures, and not only abstract forms, but animal forms. And then this is the front cover of the Landau Gospels, and it's created through a technique called repoussé, which we saw back in the Aegean chapter, where we have metalwork that is created, the imagery on it is created from hammering on the reverse side of the metal. So this book was produced roughly in the year 870, and it has gold, pearls, sapphire, garnets, and emeralds. The size of it is roughly 14 inches by 10.5 inches. And we have grieving angels that are hovering above the cross. And we also have earthbound individuals that kind of twist in agony below. The individuals directly above the cross are personifications of the sun and moon, which hide their faces in anguish. And all the figures in this work kind of just seem to float. Even Christ himself doesn't appear attached so much to the cross as he's standing in front of it. He's not hanging from it. There's no suffering, and it's kind of like the idea of the ultimate triumph over death. In 843, the Carolingian Empire is going to be divided into 3 separate parts, and each of those parts are going to be ruled by Charlemagne's grandsons, including Charles. But here we're mostly interested in Louis, who runs the eastern part of the empire. And he's going to be married to a widower himself. And when Louis passes away, his wife's family becomes the newest dynasty, and they're called the Ottonians. We're going to have Otto I, II, and III. With this work here, it's a small ivory work. In fact, it stands about 5 inches in height. And we have Otto I here, who is presenting the Magdeburg Cathedral to Christ. And look at how diminutive Otto I is presented. He is extremely small in comparison to the other biblical figures here. Behind him, we have Saint Maurice, who the church is dedicated to. And these Ottonians are really incredible warriors. These are the ones who defeated the Vikings to the north and the Hungarians to the east. And what we have is a really long period of peacetime. And when we have peace, all of a sudden we can create larger cities, trade becomes more prosperous, and also you start to have larger building projects, such as the Magdeburg Cathedral. The bad part of the story is that many of these cathedrals that are built early on employ wooden roofs. And of course, this is a time period before we have electricity, so these churches are lit with candles, and many of them catch fire. So the Magdeburg Cathedral burns down in the year 1008, only 40 years after it was built. But it's going to be rebuilt in 1049, only to burn down again in 1207, and it was rebuilt after that. Now, some of the cathedrals, like the Cathedral of Mainz, that burned down on the day of its consecration, which to me is a very bad omen. And I should tell you before we move on to these other works, this ivory plaque itself really shows you how interconnected the government and the church are. This is from the altar of the Magdeburg Cathedral. Otto II is presented here in the left-hand image as the figure at the far left, and Otto III is presented on the throne here in the image at the right. Now, Otto III's tutor is Bishop Bernward, who is the builder of St. Michael's Cathedral in Germany. And this is still an early medieval type of church. It's not at all like the Romanesque churches we're going to see in the next component of this lecture. Romanesque churches have a nave and a transept. They look very much like a cross when we look at the blueprint from above. But here we can see with St. Michael's, we have two transepts that are crossing the central nave. Besides being a scholar, Bishop Bernward was also a huge patron of the arts, and he was the one who commissioned this set of bronze doors that date back to about 1015. And remember, when we were looking at bronze, we're looking at a lot of money. The scenes on these doors depict both the Old and the New Testament. When we look at the images at the left, we read them from top to bottom in terms of chronology. So we have like the creation of Eve, her presentation to Adam, the temptation, expulsion, and down at the very bottom we have Cain slaying Abel. When we move over to the right-hand side of the image, we have New Testament themes, and we read these from the bottom to the top. So we have like the Annunciation, the Nativity, the Adoration, and Crucifixion. When we look across from one another, we have very similar themes and also very similar structural formats. For instance, we have the image at the left of the temptation, where we have the tree looking very much like the cross of the crucifixion at the right, and also we have the individuals on either side of the tree, just as we have individuals on either side of the cross. And then here we have the murder of Abel by Cain. Again, these are solid bronze doors, and they stand about 15 feet high. And so now we're going to go ahead and shift gears, and we're going to talk about Romanesque art. Romanesque art takes place right around the year 1100, and Romanesque means Roman-like. So we're going to look at relics first, and here pilgrims would travel all over Europe to visit relics, and relics are parts of saints. These can be droplets of blood. This can be a bone fragment. This could be pieces of hair or even splinters from the true cross. Relics were believed to have magical powers, that they could heal the sick and offer blessings that could minimize time in purgatory. But really what they are economic engines for the communities of these churches, because the more important the relic that you would have, the more pilgrims would come to visit that church. Also, relics would sometimes be stolen. If you had a monk, for instance, who works at a church over a period of time, but is really from a neighboring church, after he builds up that trust, in the middle of the night sometime, he might take off with that relic and bring it back to his original church. So we're going to look first at the reliquary of Saint Foy. So reliquaries hold relics, and these are brought out in ceremonies, they're brought out on specific religious days, and this one is by far the most ornamental one that you're going to see. It's just amazing. It almost looks like someone has transformed one of the covers of those books that we just looked at into a three-dimensional sculpture. This reliquary holds the remains of a young girl who refused to participate in a pagan ritual, and so we would consider her a martyr. So to define a martyr is someone who is killed because of their religious belief, a person who dies for their faith. For instance, Saint Maurice was martyred in the 3rd century for not praying to a pagan god. Another reliquary that's fairly famous is that of Saint Alexander. And here, this one's a little creepy. In fact, it's a lot creepy because it is the size of a regular human head. And it also has that look to it as one of the busts of an ancient Roman emperor, whether Nero or Constantine, but again, highly ornamented. And I also want to take a look at the changes that we have to churches during this time. And I'm going to start talking about churches here, but we're really going to focus on those in the next chapter during the Gothic Age. So St. Sernin is an absolutely beautiful church, and it is in the regular blueprint of a Romanesque or early Renaissance church. We have a crossing here. This is where the altar area would be. And then back here would be the nave where the congregation sits. So this is a blueprint that we're going to see over the next several hundred years. And both the nave, which is the north-south part here, and the transept, which is the east-west part, or the crossing of the church, are made up of barrel vaults. And of course, who created barrel vaults? But the Romans. So think of this again, tying it in to the Romanesque age. At the crossing of the church, this part here, you're going to have a groin vault. And this is where two barrel vaults intersect one another at right angles. So here's a little bit better view of the nave itself. And again, I'll be covering these a lot more as we move into this next section. But as you can see here also, this is kind of very dungeon-like. You know, we need the walls for support. There are very few windows. So these churches tend to be very dark. We have a lot of candles. I had just mentioned that some of the churches burnt down from fires started by the candles. These churches during the Romanesque time are completely stone, so they are not going to necessarily burn down like those early medieval churches are. These roofs are made up of stone. And of course the beautiful tower at St. Sernin. And this would be one of the churches along a pilgrimage route. And these were some of the main pilgrimage routes during the Renaissance age, or excuse me, during the Romanesque age. St. Sernin would be down here in France in the city of Toulouse. On the outside of churches, we have tympanums. And tympanums are defined as curving wall sections set above doorways to churches. Earlier in this lecture, I mentioned that there is an issue of literacy, that usually only the monks would be literate and who could read these illuminated manuscripts. Those are the ones who were also producing them and proofreading them. Well, for most of the people of this age, they were not literate, and so they had to learn the stories of the Bible through iconography. Many of these stories would be presented in sculpture on the outside of these churches. So here we'd be waiting outside to get into the church, and we can look up above and see an image of the Last Judgment. The Last Judgment was very common on Romanesque churches because around the year 1000 was when Christ was supposed to return. And so we're going to look through this image here. This is one of also the very few sculptural masses that we have from the Middle Ages. We don't really have sculptures in the round at this time. They're pretty much sculptures that are up against, well, what we would call relief sculptures, up against the church itself. And so here we are, we're standing outside of the church, and here are a whole bunch of other tympanums. We have Christ here in the center, surrounded by a full body halo, or what's called a mandorla. Christ is very flat, very frontal, always looking out. That's something that is very common during the medieval ages. To Christ's right, we have the saved, and to Christ's left, we have the damned, and in this case, we have the weighing of souls. Beneath Christ's feet, we have the dead that have risen from their graves, and we have some angels that are kind of hurrying everyone together. A quote under the tympanum here says, "May this terror terrify those whom earthly error binds, for the horror of these images here in this manner truly depict what will be." And we also have one of the few times the artist's name, Gisselbertus, is presented underneath Christ's feet, and he is the artist of this work. And so one of my favorite images, of course, is from underneath Christ's feet, where everyone is being hurried along, and then all of a sudden we have this figure that's literally being plucked out of the line, and it's absolutely freaking out the person to the left there. Here's a close-up of the weighing of souls. And I also want to take this time to talk about what a cathedral complex is. And we're going to head over to Italy because we're just a few hundred years away from what's going to be the start of the Italian Renaissance. But a lot of these cathedral complexes that we visit during the Renaissance were really created earlier during the Romanesque age. We have a baptistry in front, and remember this ties in with those early round churches that we covered in the last chapter. Then we have the cross-shaped church, the main cathedral. And then with Pisa, that leaning tower of Pisa behind, which you normally see in solitary images, that is the bell tower. And so we have three components that make up the cathedral complex. This one here is in Florence, and this is the Florence Cathedral, or the Santa Maria dei Fiori. And we have the baptistry in front. Then we have the cathedral complex, and that's built around the 1200s. And then we have the bell tower off to the right, and that was actually a bell tower designed by Giotto. And we'll talk all about him in about 2 lectures. And with that, this is where I'd like to end our presentation on early medieval Europe and the Romanesque